It was the summer of 2019, and I had just taken a second job to make ends meet. It wasn't glamorous, but the night shift at the security booth near a remote camping ground paid well enough to justify the long hours. The campground sat at the edge of a dense forest, surrounded by miles of empty roads and silence. I didn't mind the isolation, I actually liked it. I'd bring a thermos of coffee, some snacks, and a few magazines to get me through the night. But this night was different. Rain had started falling just as my shift began. It wasn't the usual drizzle that came and went this time of year. It was heavy, relentless, the kind that made everything feel colder and darker. By 11 p.m., the rain had turned the dirt paths into thick mud, and the sound of it hitting the metal roof of the security booth was deafening. The campground was practically deserted, which wasn't surprising. Only 2 cars were parked near the campsites, a beat-up blue sedan and an old RV. I hadn't seen anyone come or go since I arrived. I figured they were hunkered down in their tents or vehicles, waiting for the storm to pass. Around midnight, I decided to do a quick patrol. It was part of my job, even though I rarely saw anything worth noting. The flashlight I carried barely cut through the darkness, and the rain made everything slippery and slow. I walked the main path, checking the empty campsites one by one. When I reached the blue sedan, I noticed something odd. The driver's side door was slightly open, and rain was pouring inside. I shone my flashlight through the window, but the car was empty. The back seat was cluttered with clothes, empty fast food wrappers, and a couple of books. I called out, even though I knew no one would hear me over the storm. I closed the door to keep more rain from getting in and moved on. The RV was parked a little farther down the trail. It was one of those old models with peeling paint and duct tape holding parts of it together. The windows were fogged up, and the curtains were drawn. I knocked on the side, but there was no answer. It didn't feel right, but there wasn't much I could do. I finished the patrol and headed back to the booth, soaked to the bone. I poured myself a cup of coffee, hoping it would warm me up. The hours dragged on, and the rain didn't let up. Around 2 a.m., I saw headlights approaching through the sheets of rain. It was a police car. The officer stepped out, pulling his hood tight against the downpour. He was middle-aged, with a tired face that suggested he'd seen his fair share of long nights. He told me they'd received a call about a woman screaming in the area. My stomach tightened. I explained that the campground was nearly empty, but I mentioned the sedan and the RV. The officer nodded and said we should check it out together. I grabbed my flashlight, and we headed back into the rain. The sedan was still there, but nothing had changed. The officer checked the license plate and radioed it in while I stood by, feeling the cold seep into my skin. The RV was next, and this time something was different. The door was slightly ajar. The officer drew his flashlight and motioned for me to stay back. He pushed the door open and stepped inside, disappearing into the darkness. I waited, listening to the rain and the faint creak of the RV as he moved around. Then, I heard him curse under his breath. He came out a moment later, his face pale. "Stay here," he said, and went back to his car to radio for backup. Curiosity got the better of me, and I stepped closer to the RV. The door was still open, and the light from my flashlight revealed a small, cramped interior. The table was covered in food wrappers, and the floor was littered with muddy footprints. But what caught my eye was the blood. It was smeared across the floor and the walls, leading to the back of the RV. I felt my stomach churn and stepped back, nearly slipping in the mud. The officer returned quickly, telling me to stay away from the RV. He looked shaken but professional, like he was trying to keep it together. "We're locking down the area," he said. By the time backup arrived, the rain had slowed to a drizzle. A second officer joined us, and together they started searching the surrounding area. I stayed near the booth, not wanting to get in their way. It wasn't long before they found her. She was lying face down in the mud about 50 yards from the RV. Her clothes were soaked and torn, and there were deep gashes across her back and arms. The rain had washed away most of the blood, but there was no mistaking what had happened. They taped off the area and started calling in more resources. I sat in the booth trying to process what I'd just seen. The woman was probably in her mid-30s, and from the looks of it, she'd put up a fight. By dawn, the campground was swarming with police and forensic teams. They questioned me for hours, but I didn't have much to tell them. I hadn't seen or heard anything unusual, aside from the open car door and the RV. Over the next few days, details started to emerge. The woman had been traveling alone, staying in the RV. The blue sedan belonged to a man who'd been seen in the area earlier that week. They found him a few miles away, hiding in an abandoned cabin. He had a history of violence, and the evidence was overwhelming. Her blood was on his clothes, and they found a knife in his bag. He confessed during the interrogation, claiming he'd followed her to the campground and waited for the right moment. The thought of it still haunts me. She'd come to the campground looking for peace, maybe an escape from her own life, only to meet someone like him. I quit the job a week later. I couldn't bring myself to go back, not after what I'd seen. Sometimes, when it rains at night, I think about her and the sound of the rain hitting the roof of the booth. It's a reminder that no matter how safe you feel, danger can be closer than you think. I'm not sure why I agreed to go camping in the first place. It was early May 2016, and I'd just turned 27. The idea of spending a weekend in the middle of nowhere sounded like a break from the city noise, but it wasn't my usual thing. My buddy, who I'll just call Eric, had convinced me it would be fun. He picked a spot in northern Utah, near a place called Ashley National Forest. The forest wasn't totally unfamiliar to me. I'd driven through parts of it before, but I'd never camped there. It felt isolated, far enough from any towns, which Eric claimed was the point. I packed light: tent, sleeping bag, some canned food, water, and a flashlight. Eric had most of the other stuff: the stove, a cooler, and firewood. He was always prepared. We parked the truck at a small dirt pull-off on the edge of the forest. There wasn't much of a trail leading in, just an overgrown path barely visible through the brush. That should have been my first clue this wasn't going to be like one of those family-friendly campgrounds with picnic tables and RV hookups. The hike to the site took maybe 2 hours. It was tiring, but the surroundings were beautiful. Tall pine trees stretched up like skyscrapers, and the air was crisp and cool. We didn't see anyone else, which made me uneasy. I didn't say anything, though. I didn't want to sound like I couldn't handle a night in the wilderness. By the time we reached the clearing Eric had picked, the sun was starting to dip low. The spot was perfect: flat ground, surrounded by trees, and far enough from any trails that we wouldn't be disturbed. We set up camp quickly. My tent went up near the edge of the clearing, while Eric's was closer to the fire pit we built from stones we found nearby. Once the fire was going, the place felt more inviting. We cooked some food, shared a few beers, and watched the stars come out. It was peaceful in a way I wasn't used to. No car horns, no sirens, just the crackling fire and the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. Around midnight, we decided to call it a night. Eric doused the fire while I climbed into my tent. The night air was colder than I'd expected, and the sleeping bag barely kept me warm. I lay there for what felt like hours, listening to the forest. Crickets chirped steadily, and every so often, I'd hear something rustle in the distance. Probably a raccoon or a deer, I told myself. I must have fallen asleep at some point because I woke up suddenly. It was pitch black in the tent, and for a moment I couldn't remember where I was. Then I heard it, a low, guttural sound, like a growl mixed with a grunt. It came from the woods not too far from the clearing. I froze, holding my breath. My first thought was a bear, but the sound didn't match what I'd heard bears sound like on TV. It was deeper, more unnatural. I waited, straining to hear anything else. There it was again, closer this time. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might wake Eric. Then I heard footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching leaves just beyond my tent. I reached for my flashlight, fumbling with the switch. When I finally turned it on, the beam of light lit up the inside of my tent but did little to ease my fear. I didn't dare unzip the tent. Instead, I waited, listening as the footsteps circled our campsite. They weren't heavy like a bear's or quick like a deer's. They were deliberate, almost human, but something felt off. Then came the worst part. The sound stopped right outside my tent. I could hear it breathing, low and steady, just inches from where I lay. I held my breath, terrified that whatever was out there could hear me. It moved again, walking toward Eric's tent. I wanted to call out to him, but fear held me back. Then I heard something that made my blood run cold. It was Eric's voice, clear as day, calling my name. "Hey, come out here." But it wasn't Eric. The tone was off, the pitch just slightly wrong. It was like someone trying to mimic him, but not quite getting it right. I stayed silent, gripping the flashlight like it was a weapon. "Come on," the voice said again, this time more insistent. I didn't move. Minutes passed, maybe hours. I couldn't tell anymore. The sound of footsteps faded, but I didn't dare leave the tent. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I drifted into a restless sleep. When I woke up, the sun was rising. I unzipped the tent slowly, scanning the clearing. Eric's tent was empty, the flap wide open. The fire pit looked untouched, as if no one had been there. I called out his name, but the forest swallowed the sound. I searched the campsite, then the surrounding woods, but there was no sign of him. No footprints, no gear, nothing. It was like he'd vanished. I packed up what little I could carry and hiked back to the truck alone. The whole way I felt like I was being watched. Every snap of a twig made me jump. When I finally reached the truck, I found it unlocked, the keys still in the ignition. I drove straight to the nearest ranger station and told them everything. They organized a search party, but they didn't find anything. No one believed me when I told them about the voice, about how it sounded like Eric but wasn't. It's been years now, and I still don't know what happened to him. I don't go camping anymore. Sometimes, late at night, I think I hear his voice calling my name. I know better than to answer. I never thought much about camping. It was something I did every once in a while with my family when I was younger, and it was fine, but I wouldn't say I loved it. When my cousin Matt invited me on a camping trip in the summer of 2017, I figured it would be like any other. Matt was always easygoing, and he mentioned his stepsister, Emma, and her mom, Janet, would be joining us. I didn't know Emma or Janet very well. They were relatively new to the family, and we had only seen each other at a couple of family gatherings. I thought it might be a little awkward, but I figured it would be fine. We decided to camp near Pine Hollow Lake, a remote spot in northern Michigan. It wasn't a well-known area, which is what Matt liked about it. He assured me it was quiet, with plenty of space to explore without bumping into anyone. I had no reason to doubt him. It sounded peaceful, and after a long, stressful year, I thought I could use the break. We packed up 2 cars with tents, sleeping bags, coolers, and gear. I rode with Matt, while Emma and Janet followed behind us in Janet's SUV. The drive was about 3 hours, winding through rural roads and small towns before we reached the gravel path leading to the campsite. It was a bumpy ride, the trees closing in around us as we got deeper into the forest. Eventually, the path opened to a clearing near the lake. The spot was beautiful, The water was still and clear, reflecting the trees and the blue sky above. There was no one else around, just the sounds of birds and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. It felt isolated, but not in a bad way. We unloaded the cars and started setting up. Matt and I put up one tent, while Janet and Emma worked on theirs. By the time we were done, the sun was starting to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the clearing. That first night was uneventful. We cooked dinner over the fire, shared some beers, and talked about nothing in particular. Janet and Emma turned in early, while Matt and I stayed up a bit longer, staring into the fire. When we finally crawled into the tent, I fell asleep almost immediately. The next morning, we decided to explore the area. There was a trail that led around the lake and into the woods. We followed it for a while, enjoying the quiet and the fresh air. The forest was dense, the kind where sunlight barely filters through the trees. It was beautiful but easy to get turned around if you weren't paying attention. Matt pointed out some old markings on a tree, saying they were from loggers years ago. It made me think about how long this place had been untouched. We walked for hours, eventually looping back to the campsite. Janet and Emma stayed behind to relax by the water, and when we got back, they were lounging in camp chairs, reading. It was a nice day, and everything felt normal. The second night was when things started to feel off. It was subtle at first. As we sat around the fire, I thought I heard something in the woods. It was faint, like footsteps crunching leaves. I glanced at Matt, but he didn't seem to notice. I told myself it was probably an animal and tried to ignore it. Later, as I was lying in the tent, I thought I heard it again, closer this time. I sat up and listened, holding my breath. The sound stopped. I waited for what felt like an eternity, but there was nothing else. Eventually, I convinced myself I was imagining things and went back to sleep. The next day, I didn't mention it to anyone. I didn't want to sound paranoid, and besides, it was probably nothing. We spent the day swimming in the lake and hiking a bit more. The weather was perfect, and it felt good to just be outside, away from everything. That evening, as the sun was setting, Emma said she wanted to go for a walk. Janet offered to go with her, but Emma insisted she'd be fine on her own. She took a flashlight and headed off down the trail. I didn't think much of it at the time. An hour passed, then another. Emma hadn't come back. Janet started to get worried, and I could see it on Matt's face too. He grabbed a flashlight and said he'd go look for her. I offered to go with him. Janet stayed behind at the campsite, just in case Emma came back. We followed the trail, calling Emma's name. The woods were dark, and the flashlight beams didn't seem to penetrate far. The air felt heavier somehow, like the forest was closing in around us. After about 20 minutes, we found her flashlight lying on the ground. The bulb was shattered. Matt and I looked at each other, and for the first time, I felt real fear. Something was wrong. We searched the area, calling her name louder, but there was no sign of her. The forest was silent except for our voices. We headed back to camp to tell Janet. She was pale and shaking when we told her what we'd found. She wanted to call the police, but none of our phones had reception. Matt suggested we wait until morning and then drive to the nearest town to get help. I didn't like the idea of waiting, but there wasn't much else we could do. None of us slept that night. We took turns keeping watch by the fire, listening for any sound of Emma. Every so often, I thought I heard something. A twig snapping, leaves rustling, but nothing ever came of it. When the sun finally came up, we packed up as quickly as we could and headed back to the cars. But when we reached the clearing, we found something that made my stomach drop. Janet's SUV had been vandalized. The tires were slashed, and the windows were shattered. Matt's car was untouched, but the keys were gone. We were stranded. We decided to walk to the nearest town, which Matt estimated was about 10 miles away. It would take hours, but we didn't have a choice. We each took a backpack with some supplies and started down the gravel road. The whole time, I felt like we were being watched. About halfway there, Matt stopped suddenly. He pointed to the side of the road, where the grass was flattened as if something or someone had been lying there. There were footprints leading back into the woods. We didn't follow them. By the time we reached town, it was late afternoon. We went straight to the police and told them everything. They sent a search team back to the campsite, but they never found Emma. Weeks passed, then months. Emma was never found. The police said it was likely she got lost in the woods and succumbed to the elements, but I don't believe that. Something or someone was out there that night, and I can't shake the feeling that we were being watched the whole time. Even now, years later, I can't go into the woods without thinking about Emma. I wonder if she's still out there, somewhere, or if she ever made it out. But the thought that haunts me most is this: if we hadn't left when we did, would we have disappeared too? I'll never forget the winter of 2014. I was 27 at the time, freshly laid off, with no real direction or plan for my life. I needed space to think. I'd grown up near the forests of northern Minnesota, so I thought a camping trip in the remote wilderness would clear my mind. It was January, and most people would have called me crazy to camp during the harshest time of the year, but I wanted isolation. I wanted the cold to sharpen my thoughts. I loaded my gear into my old Jeep, everything I'd need to survive the trip. A heavy-duty tent, a good sleeping bag rated for extreme cold, layers of thermal clothing, a portable stove, enough food for a week, and a GPS. The plan was simple: drive as far as I could into the Superior National Forest, hike several miles off the main trail, and set up camp near a frozen lake. No distractions, just me and the silence of the wilderness. The first day went as planned. I parked at the trailhead and trekked into the woods. The snow was deeper than I'd expected, making the hike more exhausting, but the crisp air and stunning scenery kept me going. By mid-afternoon, I found a clearing near a frozen lake. It was perfect. The trees surrounding the clearing acted as a natural windbreak, and the view of the snow-covered lake was incredible. I set up my tent, started a small fire, and cooked a quick meal before the sun dipped below the horizon. That night, the silence was almost overwhelming. The only sounds were the occasional groan of the ice on the lake and the wind rustling through the trees. Took some getting used to, but I eventually fell asleep. The next morning, I woke early, the cold biting at my face even inside the tent. I layered up and decided to explore the area. The forest was eerily quiet, the snow muffling any sound. I noticed animal tracks, deer, rabbits, and something bigger that I couldn't immediately identify. Maybe a wolf or a cougar. It gave me a slight chill, but I reminded myself that animals generally avoid humans. By the third day, the isolation started to weigh on me. The novelty of being alone in the wilderness was wearing off, replaced by a gnawing unease I couldn't quite explain. I kept catching myself looking over my shoulder, convinced I wasn't alone. Once, while collecting firewood, I thought I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, a dark shape darting between the trees. I told myself it was just a deer or my imagination playing tricks on me. That night, the unease turned into full-blown paranoia. As I lay in my sleeping bag, I heard faint crunching sounds outside the tent. It wasn't the wind or the trees creaking. It was deliberate, like footsteps in the snow. I held my breath, straining to listen. The sounds would stop, then start again, circling my campsite. I grabbed the hatchet I kept by my sleeping bag and unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. The moonlight illuminated the clearing, but I didn't see anything. The footsteps stopped, and the forest was silent again. I convinced myself it was an animal, maybe a fox or a raccoon, and went back inside, though I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I checked the perimeter of my campsite. There were tracks in the snow, human tracks, leading from the forest to the edge of my tent and back again. My stomach dropped. Someone had been there, walking around my tent while I slept. I debated packing up and leaving, but part of me didn't want to give in to fear. I told myself it could have been a hunter or another camper who stumbled across my site and didn't want to disturb me. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. That day, I stayed close to camp, chopping firewood and keeping the fire going. I didn't want to wander too far and leave my supplies unguarded. As the sun began to set, I noticed the tracks again. Fresh ones, leading from the tree line toward the lake and back into the woods. They hadn't been there earlier. I decided to stay up that night, sitting by the fire with my hatchet and a flashlight, ready for whoever or whatever was out there. The hours dragged on, and the forest remained quiet. Just as I began to think I'd imagined everything, I heard it again, the crunch of snow, deliberate and slow, moving closer. I aimed my flashlight toward the sound, the beam cutting through the darkness. For a moment, I saw nothing but trees and falling snow. Then I caught a glimpse of movement, a figure just at the edge of the light, too far to make out any details. "Who's there?" I called out instinctively, breaking the silence. No response, just the sound of retreating footsteps. I didn't sleep at all that night, and as soon as the sun rose, I made the decision to leave. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could, constantly glancing toward the trees, expecting to see the figure watching me. The hike back to my Jeep was grueling. The snow felt heavier, the forest darker. Every crack of a branch or rustle of wind made me jump. When I finally reached the trailhead and saw my Jeep, relief washed over me. But that relief was short-lived. As I loaded my gear into the Jeep, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Written in the frost on the driver's side window were two words, "Stay safe." I never saw or heard from anyone in that forest again, but I haven't been able to shake the feeling that whoever, or whatever, was out there wanted me to know they could have done much worse. It was the summer of 2015 when I decided to go on a solo camping trip in the Australian Outback. I was 28 at the time, and the thought of escaping the noise of the city for a few days sounded perfect. I had always loved camping, but this time, I wanted to go somewhere remote, somewhere far from the usual campgrounds filled with other people. I wanted solitude, just me and nature. I spent weeks researching and planning the trip. I picked a spot in Western Australia, deep in the wilderness, far from any towns or roads. The nearest civilization was hours away. I packed everything I thought I'd need: a sturdy tent, enough food and water for a week, a satellite phone in case of emergencies, and my trusty knife. I was confident I'd prepared for anything that could come my way. The drive to the campsite took most of the day. The farther I drove, the fewer signs of human life I saw. No cars, no buildings, just miles of red dirt, scrubby trees, and endless sky. By late afternoon, I reached a dirt track that led even deeper into the bush. I followed it until it ended, parked my car, and hiked another 2 hours to reach the spot I'd marked on my map. It was perfect, flat ground surrounded by trees, with a small creek nearby for water. The first night was uneventful. I set up my tent, cooked dinner on my portable stove, and sat by a small fire, listening to the sounds of the wilderness. The Outback has a way of making you feel small, like you're just a tiny speck in a vast, untamed world. The stars were incredible, brighter than I'd ever seen them. I felt at peace, exactly what I'd hoped for. The second day I spent exploring the area. I followed the creek for a while, keeping an eye out for wildlife. I saw kangaroos in the distance and a few lizards sunning themselves on rocks. The heat was intense, but I was used to it. I made sure to drink plenty of water and stay in the shade when I could. That evening, I cooked dinner again and settled in for another quiet night. But as the sun dipped below the horizon and the shadows grew longer, I started to feel uneasy. I couldn't explain it. There was no obvious reason for it. No strange sounds, no signs of danger. Just a feeling like I wasn't alone. I told myself I was imagining things. Being out in the middle of nowhere can mess with your head if you're not used to it. But the feeling didn't go away. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing there. That night, I didn't sleep well. I woke up several times, convinced I'd heard something outside the tent. A faint rustling, the snap of a twig. Every time, I told myself it was just the wind or an animal. But deep down, I wasn't sure. The next morning, I found footprints near my campsite. Human footprints. They weren't mine. They were larger, wider, and the tread didn't match my boots. They led from the trees near the creek, circled my tent, and then disappeared back into the bush. My stomach dropped. I tried to stay calm, telling myself there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe someone else was camping nearby, though I hadn't seen or heard anyone. Maybe a park ranger had passed through, though this area wasn't part of any national park. I decided to stay alert but not panic. I spent the day close to my campsite, gathering firewood and keeping an eye on my surroundings. I didn't see anyone or anything unusual, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That night, I built a bigger fire, hoping it would make me feel safer. I kept my knife close and the satellite phone within arm's reach. I sat by the fire until late, scanning the darkness for any signs of movement. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke up to the sound of something snapping, a loud, deliberate crack, like a branch being broken in two. My heart pounded as I grabbed my flashlight and shone it into the trees. The beam of light revealed nothing but empty bush. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat in my tent with the knife in my hand, listening to every sound. I kept telling myself I'd pack up and leave at first light. When morning came, I stepped outside and froze. There was something new near my tent, a single object placed carefully on the ground. It was a piece of wood, roughly carved into the shape of a human figure. I stared at it, my mind racing. Who had left it? Why? I looked around, but there was no one in sight. I decided I wasn't going to stick around to find out. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could, constantly glancing over my shoulder. I didn't care about the scenic hike back to my car anymore. I just wanted to leave. The walk back felt longer than it should have. Every rustle of leaves, every bird call made me jump. I felt exposed, like someone or something was following me, just out of sight. When I finally reached my car, I practically threw my gear into the back and started the engine. I didn't feel safe until I was back on the main road, miles away from the campsite. Even now, years later, I can't explain what happened out there. Maybe it was just some local messing with me, but it felt more deliberate than that. Whoever or whatever it was, they knew I was there and they wanted me to know I wasn't welcome. I haven't been camping since. I always loved camping. There was something about being surrounded by nature, away from the noise of everyday life, that felt freeing. In the summer of 2016, I decided to head out for a solo camping trip to a forest in western Montana. It wasn't a well-known spot, just a patch of wilderness I'd stumbled upon a year earlier while hiking with some friends. Back then, I'd promised myself I'd return to explore it on my own. I was 27 at the time and confident in my outdoor skills. I'd been camping since I was a kid, taught by my dad how to build a fire, read a map, and respect the wilderness. The spot I chose was deep in the forest, about 5 miles from the nearest road. It wasn't part of a campground, which was exactly what I wanted. I packed my gear, a sturdy tent, sleeping bag, some food, water, and a small camp stove. I even brought a little emergency kit, though I didn't think I'd need it. The hike in was peaceful. The trees were tall and dense, blocking out most of the sunlight, and the air smelled like pine and damp earth. I didn't see another person the entire way. After a couple of hours, I reached a small clearing by a stream and decided it was the perfect spot. The water was clear and cold. The sound of it trickling over rocks was calming, and the clearing was just big enough for my tent. I spent the first day setting up camp, gathering wood for a fire, and enjoying the quiet. By the time the sun started to set, I had a fire crackling and a small pot of soup heating on the stove. The night came quickly in the forest, the darkness pressing in on all sides, but the firelight made it feel cozy. I sat there for hours, staring at the flames and listening to the sounds of the forest, crickets chirping, the occasional rustle of leaves, and the distant hoot of an owl. I went to bed feeling content, but sometime in the night, I woke up suddenly. At first, I wasn't sure what had woken me. The forest was silent, the kind of silence that feels heavy, like something is holding its breath. I lay still, listening, but all I could hear was my own heartbeat. Then I noticed it, a faint crunching sound, like someone or something stepping on dry leaves. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. I'd seen tracks near the stream earlier. Still, the sound put me on edge. It was slow and deliberate, not the quick, darting movements of a small animal. I stayed awake for a long time, straining to hear, but eventually, the sound stopped and I fell back asleep. The next morning, I tried to shake off the unease. The sun was shining, and the forest felt alive again. I decided to spend the day exploring. I followed the stream for a while, then cut through the trees, marking my path with little ribbons of bright orange tape so I wouldn't get lost. I didn't see anything unusual, just trees, rocks, and more trees. By late afternoon, I was back at camp. I'd worked up an appetite, so I made a quick meal and sat by the stream to eat. As I was finishing, I noticed something strange. There was a footprint in the mud by the water larger than mine. It looked fresh. I stood there staring at it, trying to make sense of it. Could have been from a hunter or another hiker, but I hadn't seen or heard anyone since I arrived. That night, the unease from the previous night returned. I sat by the fire, staring into the darkness, my ears straining for any sound. I didn't hear anything unusual, but the forest felt different, like it was watching me. When I finally crawled into my tent, I kept my knife close, just in case. I was drifting off to sleep when I heard it again, the crunching sound. This time it was closer. My heart was pounding so hard I thought whoever, or whatever, it was could probably hear it. I stayed completely still, my hand gripping the knife. The sound moved around the camp, slow and deliberate, like it was circling. I wanted to believe it was an animal, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. Animals don't move like that. And then, as suddenly as it started, the sound stopped. The rest of the night was a blur of fear and exhaustion. When the sun finally rose, I packed up my camp as quickly as I could. I didn't bother eating or even making coffee. I just wanted to get out of there. The hike back to the road felt endless. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made me jump. I kept looking over my shoulder, convinced I was being followed, but I never saw anything. When I finally reached my car, I felt a wave of relief. I threw my gear into the trunk, locked the doors, and didn't look back. For weeks after that trip, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been out there with me. Maybe it was just a coincidence, a lone footprint and some noises in the dark. But deep down, I knew better. Someone or something was out there, watching me, and they wanted me to know it. I haven't been back to that forest since. It was late September, and the trees were starting to change color in northern Michigan. I had decided to spend the weekend camping, hoping to enjoy some time away from work and the constant hum of the city. I was 34 years old, single, and I loved the outdoors. Being alone in the wilderness gave me a sense of peace I couldn't find anywhere else. I chose a remote spot in Hiawatha National Forest, far from any official campsites or well-traveled trails. It was one of those places where you had to park on the side of a gravel road, throw on your backpack, and hike for miles into the forest. That's exactly what I wanted: solitude, quiet, and the chance to disconnect. I parked my car around noon on Friday, packed up my gear, and started hiking. The air was crisp and cool, but the sun was warm on my back. The trail wasn't marked, but I had a good map and a GPS just in case. After about 5 miles, I found a flat clearing near a small lake. The water was calm and clear, reflecting the golden leaves of the trees around it. It was perfect. I spent the rest of the afternoon setting up camp. My tent was a small one-person setup, just big enough for me and my gear. I gathered firewood, filtered water from the lake, and prepared a simple dinner of instant noodles and jerky. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, I had a small fire crackling and my sleeping bag laid out inside the tent. The first night was uneventful. The sound of the wind through the trees and the occasional rustle of small animals in the underbrush lulled me to sleep. I woke up once in the middle of the night to the sound of coyotes howling in the distance, but they didn't come close. Saturday morning, I decided to explore the area. I left most of my gear at camp, taking only a day pack with water, snacks, and a knife. The forest was dense, but there were game trails that made walking easier. I followed one trail for a couple of hours, climbing a small ridge that overlooked the lake. From up there, I could see how isolated I was. No signs of civilization, no roads, no power lines, nothing but trees stretching to the horizon. On the way back to camp, I noticed something odd. A section of the trail I'd walked earlier looked different. Some of the leaves and dirt had been disturbed, like something heavy had been dragged across it. I stopped and stared at it for a moment, trying to figure out what it could be. Maybe a deer had been injured and stumbled through, or maybe it was just my imagination. I shrugged it off and kept walking. When I got back to camp, everything seemed normal. My tent and gear were untouched, and the fire pit was just as I'd left it. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The forest felt quieter than it had earlier, and I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something watching me. That night, I had trouble sleeping. The wind had picked up, and the trees creaked and groaned as they swayed. I kept hearing faint noises, twigs snapping, leaves crunching. But every time I unzipped the tent and shined my flashlight outside, there was nothing there. Around midnight, I finally drifted off, but it didn't last long. I woke up to the sound of something moving just outside my tent. It was slow and deliberate, like someone or something was circling the campsite. My heart was pounding, but I stayed completely still, hoping it would go away. After what felt like forever, the sound stopped. I didn't hear anything else for the rest of the night, but I barely slept. The next morning, I found footprints in the dirt near my tent. They weren't mine. They were larger, heavier, and the tread pattern didn't match my boots. My stomach dropped. Someone had been here, walking around my camp while I slept. I packed up as quickly as I could, stuffing my gear into my backpack and putting out the fire. I decided to cut the trip short and head back to the car. As much as I loved the solitude, the idea of a stranger wandering around my camp in the middle of the night was too much. The hike back felt longer than it had on the way in. I kept hearing noises, branches snapping, leaves rustling. But every time I stopped to look, I didn't see anything. I told myself it was just animals, but the paranoia was getting to me. When I finally reached the gravel road where I'd parked, I felt a wave of relief. But that relief quickly turned to dread. My car, which I'd left locked and hidden behind some bushes, was gone. I stood there, stunned, trying to process what had happened. There were no tire tracks or signs of a struggle. It was like the car had just vanished. I was miles from the nearest town with no cell service and no idea what to do. I thought about walking down the road, but I didn't know which direction to go. Instead, I decided to head back into the forest, hoping to find a high point where I could get a signal on my phone. As I walked, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. Every time I stopped to catch my breath, I felt like someone was just out of sight, hiding in the trees. By late afternoon, I found a ridge and climbed to the top. I pulled out my phone and held it up, praying for a signal. Nothing. That's when I heard it. A low, guttural laugh coming from somewhere below me. It wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Slowly, I turned around, scanning the trees for any sign of movement. There was nothing. I didn't wait to find out who or what was down there. I ran. I don't know how long I ran or where I was going. I just kept moving, desperate to put as much distance as possible between me and whatever was out there. Eventually, I stumbled into a clearing and collapsed. I was exhausted, hungry, and completely lost. As night fell, I realized I had no choice but to stay where I was. I built a small fire, more for comfort than warmth, and sat with my back against a tree, clutching my knife. The sounds of the forest grew louder as the darkness closed in. I thought I heard footsteps, whispers, even the occasional laugh, but I couldn't tell if it was real or just my mind playing tricks on me. By the time the sun rose, I was barely holding it together. I decided to keep walking, hoping to stumble across a trail or a road. After hours of wandering, I found a dirt path that looked like it had been used recently. I followed it, praying it would lead me to safety. The path eventually led to a small cabin, tucked away in the trees. It looked old and abandoned, but I didn't have a choice. I knocked on the door, then pushed it open when no one answered. The inside was empty, just a single room with a table, a chair, and a cot. I was about to leave when I noticed something on the table, a set of car keys. My car keys. I grabbed them and bolted out of the cabin, not caring who might have left them there. When I finally made it back to the road, my car was parked exactly where I'd left it. The doors were unlocked, but everything inside was untouched. I didn't stop to question it. I got in, started the engine, and drove as fast as I could back to civilization. To this day, I don't know who was out there with me or why they took my keys and moved my car. All I know is that I'm never camping alone again.